Hello everyone, this is probably one of the concluding videos in the introductory series of appreciating poetry. After this we will be moving on to specific poems. So in the initial classes we discussed certain functions of poetry, how poetry can be treated as a kind of cultural artifact, and then we moved on to the thought why actually we should critically analyze poetry, and now we are moving on to how to critically analyze poetry. There are definitely a lot of ways, but I am going to mention probably some significant ways in which you can analyze poetry as a student of literature. So whenever you analyze any kind of art, most of the time there are two categorizations which will help you classify your criticism or appreciation. So when we look into poetry also, we can do the same kind of classification. So imagine that you are critiquing a cinema or a movie. How will you do it? You might think about the theme and the script of the movie, but along with that you might also be looking at the technical aspects of it, which might include the cinematography, the mode of presentation. So to conclude, when you look at an art form, you look at two things essentially. What does the creator of the work say, and how does he say it? What does the creator of the work say, and how does he say it? Which can be in technical terms called as the form and the content. The form and the content. The how could be the technical, stylistic and form related aspects, and what could be the content or thematic aspects. So two aspects are looked into when you analyze poetry critically: the form and the content. The form includes the stylistic or structural aspects of it, while the content would be about the thematic aspects of it, what the author has to say, and the form, how the author says what he has to say. So we'll take up form initially. When it comes to form, what are the things we can look into? We can look into a lot of things, like the diction or the vocabulary used, the techniques which have been used, the stylistic techniques which include the figures of speech, similes, metaphors, or enjambment, or hyperboles. So these kinds of techniques used, and also the meter of the poem. And how do you identify meter? You divide them into pairs of syllables, and you mark stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, and then you find out their meter. Imagine that there are 5 pairs, and the unstressed stressed pattern is followed. It will be iambic pentameter. The unstressed stressed pattern is called iamb, and there are 5 iambs. When I categorized, it will be iambic pentameter. And similarly, you identify the meter. How many pairs are there? 5, which is called penta. So it is an iambic meter, because unstressed stressed pattern is followed. It becomes iambic pentameter. Similarly, you can identify other meters. So meter and diction, figures of speech, and the genre or free verse is there, and iambic pentameter, blank verse. There are different kinds of meters of poetry, and then you can look at the rhyme scheme, and also look at how certain kind of imagery is presented. All these things, all these stylistic aspects, the choice of words, all these stylistic aspects come under form, and the stanza structure, all these things you can and the musical quality of it, all these things you can discuss when you critically analyze the form of that poem. And when you move on to the content of the poem or the thematic aspects of the poem, how do you do it? How do you go about it? Now there would always be this taken for granted meaning, which is probably the most of the people, which is the meaning which most of the people adhere to, because it has become kind of popular, or the meaning which you get on a primary reading of a poem. There would be this very plain kind of a meaning, I would say, superficial meaning, I would say. But for a student of literature, you should go further, you should dig deeper. You close read each line and look for associations and probable meanings. Earlier I said most of the time this thought that what could have the author intended was very predominant when it comes to the analysis of poetry. Nowadays we do not think about that at all, but rather we think about what are the possible meanings that I can bring out from these lines. The author may not have intended that at all, but you are enriching this text by giving it so much more meaning. So imagine that the author has just written a love poem. You can actually read into much above the plain meaning of the poem. It could have been a love poem, but it could actually tell you a lot about the author's conceptions of the gender roles or the prevailing gender roles in his time. So there is this dialogue or this quotation which I always quote in literature classes: behind every book is a man, and behind the man is the race, and behind the race is the natural, social, political and cultural environments that shape that race. So every work of art, every poetic work has been composed by a man, and that man is not an isolated being, but rather his psyche, which actually creates this work, is a product of all the kinds of social tensions that are around him, the political conditions around him, all the social notions around him. So all these inspire him to write. So every work thus is in a way a kind of repertoire of meanings. Every word that he chooses, we can find associations, we can historically place them even, and identify new meanings to it. We can enrich any poetic work in that way. So apart from looking into literal meanings of the work, for instance, the poet has written something and you elevate the meaning a bit, but beyond that you can actually place it in a different kind of a social context or a political context and give it new meanings. That is, there could be ideas that the author takes for granted, there could be prejudices within the mind of the author, there could be reflections of the social conditions of the time which have been unconsciously reflected in the work, or there could be clues about the social circumstances in the work. And also you can deconstruct the work. That is, you can completely throw away the standard meaning of the work and give it an entirely new interpretation based on history or based on some other theoretical concept if you want to. Imagine that you are reading a love poem. You can completely deconstruct it, thinking of it from a Marxian perspective or a feminist perspective. Or imagine that you're reading about a poem between the relationship between a parent and a child. You can completely deconstruct it using psychoanalytic theory. So what you're doing is looking at the poem from an entirely different perspective. Theories actually help you do that. Every theoretical perspective would offer a new meaning to the poem. So if you look at a love poem from a new historicist analysis, you actually might be able to place it in some point of history and understand the kind of power structures which are prevalent there and how those power structures inspire this poem unconsciously. So similarly, all theoretical concepts which you are familiar with can actually provide different kinds of reading to the same literary work or same poem. So you closely read the work, you look at each word and each line of the poem and identify associations with the social context, with further linguistic meanings, and you enrich the text. So the form and the content. When it comes to the content, there are immense possibilities of looking at it from different theoretical perspective, looking at it from different linguistic angles, looking at it from different sociological perspectives, and using it as a text to analyze the society from which this poem was born, to analyze the social conditions which gave birth to such a poem. So these are the things which you can keep in mind. I'll just give you an example maybe, which will help you understand it better. Now, A Valediction Forbidding Morning is a poem which most of the time is very glorified as a love poem. An analysis of its form. Of course, the meter would be there, and the poetic tools like hyperbole and enjambment, all that will be there. There would be a rhyme scheme. You can look into all that. But when it comes to the content analysis, you can, of course, glorify the lover's love and say that it's so beautiful, the kind of affection or the kind of loyalty that the husband expects from the wife. You can do all that, which would be the plain superficial meaning of it. But imagine that you look at it from a feminist perspective. Maybe you understand that the gender roles expected there are that the woman should be domesticated and stay indoors while the man can wander as much as he wants to. And if you look at it from a Marxian perspective, you will understand that it was a time when a lot of sea trade was happening, and men folk were traveling in search of wealth in the third world countries, in the new colonies. So this is also about history, this is also about economy. And imagine that if you look at it from a psychoanalytic perspective, you might get an entirely different reading. Or if you look at it from probably maybe what archetypal criticism, you might get an entirely different meaning. Similarly, you can enrich the same text, give it new dimensions of meanings with diverse perspectives. So I'll conclude for the time being with that example. So we have a lot of poems to learn, and we will discuss further analytical strategies while we actually delve into each poem, because you are free to interpret poems the way you want to. You do not have to stick to any particular framework. These are just pointers towards analyzing poems. So these are not like hard and fast rules as such. Just go by your instinct, find associations and justify those associations with the help of other theoreticians or material from the text of the poem itself. So similarly, you can perform wonderful analysis of poems. So I hope you guys will try it out with the poems that you love, you hold dear. So we'll be winding up for today. Thank you for listening, guys. Take care.